Story 1. More planning ahead. You had to know where you were going or get directions ahead of time. And if you were meeting up with someone, you had to agree on a time and a place. Story 2. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to already know how to get there, or consult a paper map which you kept in your car. If you needed to call somewhere, like a store, your bank, the veterinarian, or a car repair place, you had to look the number up. This could be on your desktop computer at home, or longer ago than that, in a phone book. If you had a random thought like, when was air conditioning invented, or how far is it to Argentina, or how old is Dick Van Dyke? Generally, you would just keep wondering. You weren't used to being constantly entertained. On a car trip, or in a waiting room, or in a long line, you would watch other people, think about things, maybe read a book. People were more comfortable just sitting with their thoughts. People took a lot fewer pictures. If you went on vacation or had a family event, you would bring a camera and take pictures. Then you would drop the film off at a store and get your pictures a few days later, or an hour later if you wanted to spend a lot. You never knew until you picked them up if the shots were any good, or if someone's eyes were closed or your finger got in the way of the lens. Story 3. Feels like a beautiful dream now. I remember running outside with friends, feeling the sun on my face, not glued to a screen. We would talk and laugh, share secrets, and make silly memories. It was simple, pure happiness. Story 4. People talking together, not always thinking about the fact you could be filmed or photographed while doing foolish things, being able to not be contacted. Man, I'm nostalgic for the good old days now. Story 5. We spent much more time on computers, surfing forums, and early social media like MySpace and many other similar sites, where we would meet people and then spend hours talking to them on instant messengers like Microsoft Network, America Online, and Yahoo Messenger, as well as Skype. Story 6. Better and, I'd say, slower. You had to plan ahead, use landline phones, and often a family member would get on the phone. You asked if your friend was at home and if you could come over. Another thing was with the letters and postcards. You'd send letters by mail when you had a pen pal in another country, and it could take weeks for the letter to arrive. Then it would take the same amount of time to receive the reply. It wasn't easy to connect with people on the other side of the earth. I guess that's more an internet than a smartphone thing. In daily life, it wasn't that everyone was talking to each other when waiting at the bus stop or something like that. Many people just waited, remained silent, and read the newspaper or whatever. Today, everyone is glued to their phone screens, but it wasn't the case that everyone was extroverted and engaged in small talk in such situations. For photos, except for the Polaroids, you had to use a camera and then develop the film in a store lab. Sometimes the vacation photos you thought would be great were useless, like blurred, etc. As a kid and teenager, there was more trust because without smartphones and global positioning system, there was no way to just contact and locate someone. As a kid of the early 80s, we were just told, get outside with your friends, do something, come back when it gets dark. And that was it. Story 7. Your friends called you to tell you good or bad news instead of expecting you to follow them on 9 different social platforms and just know what is going on. Story 8. It was amazing and it sucked. You were free, you were unreachable and untraceable. However, I remember wasting a lot of time trying to locate friends to hang out with. Knock on the friend's door, Joe is at Jimmy's, head to Jimmy's, they just left for John's, head to John's. Nah, you missed them, they went out. Sometimes you just missed the call, no message was left, and that was it. A good time happened, but you weren't in the right place at the right time. Without a world of information, we had to discuss things and come to a consensus on topics like stupid stuff. Where did this guy get traded from before he was with such team, who led what league in rushing, points, etc. It was fun, and we had long conversations about it. But it also sucked because darn it, some stuff we just wanted to know the answer to, and you couldn't get the answer. Finally, we knew what it was like to be bored and not have a television in front of us every day. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Story 9. People like to reminisce nostalgically about it, but truthfully, it wasn't that different from life today. Most of the things that are really different now are because of the internet in general, not specifically having the internet in your pocket. Here are just a few specific areas where things looked pretty different. You were alone with your thoughts more when doing things like waiting at the doctor's office. Honestly, this was probably the biggest difference. You can, of course, do this now, but most people look at their phones instead. No judgment meant, just saying what is and was. In general, people read books and magazines more because that was the default. I have to sit for a while, activity while out of the house. Again, no judgment. Most of the books and magazines were kind of garbage, and I'm not saying they were necessarily more edifying than what people are scrolling now. Most of us weren't reading Dostoevsky while waiting at the Department of Motor Vehicles. We had texting for a little bit before smartphones, but it was a pain. Screening calls was common, so voicemail was generally the default way to reach someone. We used to print out driving directions before leaving the house when going somewhere new because most of us didn't have global positioning system navigation, which would have only been built into the car, not your phone. To me, the global positioning system maps were the #1 killer app of the smartphone that made me get my first iPhone, especially with live bus and train times. I live in Chicago. Social plans were much more set in stone. It was harder to change plans at the last minute, so people generally set very clear plans and stuck to them. There was a lot more social stigma about bailing on plans at the last minute or not showing up. And there was no such thing as playing the night by ear. You couldn't be like, I'm at this party now, but if it ends early, we'll meet up somewhere later. And especially before cell phones of any kind, there was no, hey, we all ended up at the International House of Pancakes. Want to join us? You made plans hours in advance, or they just didn't happen. This one could kind of be the internet in general, but there was just a lot more face-to-face and ad hoc human interaction in every kind of transaction. If you wanted to order Chinese food, you called on the phone to say what you wanted and drove to pick it up in person. If you wanted a cab, you had to actually call a dispatcher and talk to them, and there were more yellow cabs to hail impromptu in the street since there was no Uber or Lyft. And I spent a lot more time at brick-and-mortar stores to shop. There was a little time before modern smartphones where this wasn't as much the case because we did have number storage in the earlier cell phones, but for a long time you had a much smaller roster of people you could just call on the fly. You had to have the number written down somewhere, or you had to have it memorized. I remember a lot more referrals like, I'm going to call Jane and ask her to call Bill about our plans tomorrow, rather than just texting Bill. There were more intermediaries, and that made the social connections a little more essential. There was a lot of taking notes by hand, in cursive because that was fastest. Some folks didn't like carrying a notebook around, so it was actually quite common to see folks with notes written in pen on their own hands. I do that all the time. There were more impromptu conversations with strangers because people spent less time focused on the digital layer and were more present and accessible in person. Sometimes if you didn't know a fact, you just weren't going to know that fact. Was Johnny Depp in Halloween? I don't know. Oh well. Story 10. It was awesome being a teenager in the 90s. Everyone had pagers, and with the pager, everyone had their own unique code. So you'd know who was paging you from a random phone number. You could get away with almost anything. Parties were in fields, and no one knew where they were outside of the friends groups to bust them up. People had memories and attention spans like you couldn't believe. I knew hundreds of phone numbers. I could go on and on. It was just better. Story 11. Offline was offline. Dating did not come with a mobile crowd. Time pressure is constant through the necessary connectivity to actually accomplish less in any setting. Yet we walked around not knowing much of anything other than what we had in our memory. The internet and social networks were intended to facilitate the information age, not misinformation or rage. Story 12. Slower, calmer, more sociable. Technically, it is not that different in that we could do the things before that you can do on a smartphone now, but I think by today's standards it would seem like a task just to get it done. The biggest change, I think, is not so much the phone itself, but simply how much time we spend on it. I can mindlessly browse with no purpose. Before, I must have actually been doing things. Story 13. People were way more social. People did more outside activities. People were more patient. People didn't sit at traffic lights on their phones and need to be honked at. Way less anxiety. People were way less focused on politics. Many other things. Smartphones are very useful, but also very dangerous. Story 14. I've just come in from a concert. The last time I saw this artist was 20 years ago. Last time, there was a lot less seeing it through the row in front of me's phone screens. Story 15. I remember getting the first iPhone and giving it to people to take photos and having to tell them to press the button on the screen. They would always tap the home button. Never got a lot of photos. Ha! Story 16. You had to talk to people's parents on the phone if we called their house. We made prank phone calls instead of scrolling TikTok. We left the house and nobody knew where we were. We were free except for the thing where we had to talk to people's parents on the phone. Story 17. I remember being able to put contacts into a phone. You used to have to remember phone numbers. It wasn't horrible, though, as you weren't tethered to every single person you knew. You'd have to just go off and do stuff, and there was not much expectation for you to be in touch. People visited each other way more. Story 18, you had to look things up the old-fashioned way, you had to have paper maps in your car, you had to memorize your friends' numbers, you talked to people more social engagement. Story 19, sane. No social influencers, no pretend celebrities, no platforms of hate, no platforms for the insanely stupid, no readily available disinformation, no self-serving echo chambers. In many ways, life was good. It was also easier to meet people. It was easier to date. And people looked each other in the eye and seemed to have more basic respect for each other. Just my thoughts. Story 20. People would set up a time and a place to meet. If they didn't show, you found a payphone to call their house. Most of the time they weren't there because they were on their way to the meetup location, so you'd leave some awkward voice message on their answering machine. Story 21. I think one of the biggest differences was being out and about and not knowing something or having a disagreement over something. Now someone will just pull their phone out and we know. Then it was waiting till you get home, and if you remember, you can look it up and then text or call your friend and tell them, assuming you had any time minutes and hadn't used all your text messages. Story 22. You memorized most phone numbers. You used physical maps and got lost a bit. Also, imagine calling your crush and her parents or annoying siblings answer the phone. You could also relax a lot more. There was no electric leash in your pocket. When you were off work, you were really off from work. Some families had really expensive encyclopedias to look things up. They were huge sets of physical books. No email on your phone. Payphones were a real thing. Also, at this time, there was no streaming, so going to the movies was a big deal. Story 23. For me, it was more or less the same as it is now, except I paid more library fines, got lost more often, and if I wasn't at home or in my office, no one could reach me. The unreachability was actually great, and I highly recommend it. Story 24. Jesus Christ, smartphones have been around for 5 minutes. Ignore all these comments about analog phones. It wasn't that long ago you always went out with change in case you needed to use a public phone. Story 25. You made plans with your friends to hang out after school. If you didn't, you called their home phone, and if there was no answer or they weren't there, you called another friend. If nobody picked up, you figured you'd see them tomorrow instead. Story 26. We had to figure things out. We had to remember phone numbers and learn how to read maps and road signs. We followed recipes in cookbooks. We looked up information at the library using the cards in the drawers. I am 65, and at the risk of being rude, I feel like we were more intelligent in many ways because we always had to think it through and depend on ourselves. Story 27. The same, only slower and less convenient. Smartphone, personal digital assistant, desktop, book, scroll, word of mouth. They all do the same things at slower speeds. For navigation, you would just have your kid in the passenger seat reading a global positioning system printout or a pre-written map route. For reference, you would either look it up on a desktop or in a book. I love how people act like pre-smartphone people were just smacking rocks together and drooling, performing arcane rituals to do the simplest of tasks. Story 28. I grew up in India in the 90s, long before smartphones became common. They only started catching on in the early 2010s. Life was simpler but full of quirks and routines that seem so distant now. Unsupervised play. As kids, we would leave the house and roam around the neighborhood until sunset. My mom usually had no idea where we were, but it was almost always one of the 4 friends' houses nearby. Payphones everywhere. Making calls meant queuing up at the neighborhood payphone or using landlines sparingly. Asking for directions. When we traveled to a different city, my dad would stop strangers on the street to ask for directions. Google Maps was unimaginable. Spontaneous visits. We would often show up at an uncle's house unannounced. If they did not answer the doorbell, it simply meant they were not home. Cooking shows. My mom would watch them with a pen and notebook in hand, ready to scribble down recipes in real time. Pagers and telegrams. Pagers were a big deal when I was a preteen. I even received birthday wishes via an actual wired telegram once. Not the app, but the original. Conversations everywhere. People would strike up chats while standing in queues or waiting for a bus. Flashlights. Flashlights were an everyday carry item, especially for after-dinner walks, since streetlights were not always reliable.